Some people leave flowers on graves to honor the dead.
My mother's grave?
Isabella Russo left them because the dead were the only ones who never asked her why she was crying. The cemetery at dusk smelled of rain and stone, and the grave marked Luca Moretti. Beloved mother had become her confessional, a place where silence didn't feel like loneliness. She didn't know that grief, like secrets, has a way of calling to those who share it. And she didn't know that the man watching her from the shadows had been searching for answers in that same silence for 3 long years. Welcome back to Mafia Folklore. Before this story begins, tell me something. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It helps us know how far the legend of the Mafia travels tonight. Now, let's begin. Isabella's knees pressed into the cold earth, her fingertips brushing the petals of white lilies she'd arranged in a careful arc along the headstone. She always brought lilies. They were her mother's favorite once, before everything fell apart, before the world became a place where Isabella learned to make herself small. The grave belonged to a stranger, or at least it had started that way. 3 years ago, a man in a black suit had walked into her flower shop on Mulberry Street and ordered an arrangement for a funeral. White lilies, white roses, baby's breath. No card, no message, just an address and a date. She delivered them herself, standing at the back of the procession, watching mourners dressed in expensive grief. She'd seen the son, tall, stone-faced, untouchable. She'd seen the way he didn't cry. And she'd seen the man in the gray coat slip away before the casket was lowered. The same man who'd walked into her shop 2 days earlier, asking questions about who ordered flowers, who attended, who knew. She should have said something then. She should have told someone. But Isabella had learned long ago that speaking up only made you a target. So she stayed quiet. She kept her head down. And every week since, she came to this grave, leaving flowers like an apology she could never voice aloud. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind threading through the trees. "I should have said something. I should have—" "Why are you crying at my mother's grave?" The voice came from behind her, low and sharp as a blade drawn in the dark. Isabella's breath caught. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. He stood 10 feet away, framed by the dying light. Luca Moretti. She recognized him instantly. The same man from the funeral. The same cold, unreadable expression. But now, up close, she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines of his face, the tension coiled in his shoulders like a man who hadn't rested in years. Her voice broke. She tried again. "I didn't mean to answer the question." His tone didn't rise, but the command in it made her flinch. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. She could lie. She could say she was visiting a nearby grave, that she'd gotten lost, that she didn't know who Luca Moretti was. But the way he was looking at her, like he could see straight through every wall she'd built, told her that lying would only make this worse. "I sold the flowers," she said quietly. "For her funeral." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something dangerous. "That's not an answer." Isabella's hands trembled. She curled them into fists, pressing them against her thighs to steady herself. The words clawed their way up her throat before she could stop them. "Because I saw who really killed her." Silence. The kind of silence that swallows sound, that makes the air feel too thick to breathe. Luca's jaw tightened. He took a step forward, and Isabella fought every instinct screaming at her to run. Say that again, he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze, even though her legs felt like they might give out beneath her. 2 days before the funeral, a man came into my shop. He asked about the flowers someone ordered for Luca Moretti. He wanted to know who placed the order, when, how it was paid for. I didn't think anything of it then, but... Her voice wavered. I saw him at the funeral. He left before it ended, and when I heard on the news that her death was ruled an accident, I knew... You knew what? Luca's voice was steel now. I knew it wasn't. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just stared at her, his dark eyes searching hers like he was trying to decide if she was telling the truth or if she was the most dangerous kind of liar. Then he turned his head slightly, and 2 men emerged from the shadows, broad-shouldered, silent, watching. Isabella's stomach dropped. What's your name? Luca asked. Isabella, she breathed. Isabella Russo. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he was committing it to memory. Go home, Isabella Russo, he said quietly. Lock your doors. Don't talk to anyone. Don't leave your house. Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Luca's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, and for the first time, she saw something beneath the coldness. Something raw and unhealed. Because if what you're saying is true, he said, you just made yourself the most valuable person in this city. He turned and walked away, his men following like shadows. Isabella stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She didn't know it yet, but that truth she'd spoken, the one she'd carried alone for 3 years, had just rewritten the rest of her life. And by sunrise, the entire neighborhood would know her name. Isabella didn't sleep. She lay in her small apartment above the flower shop, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word she'd said at the grave. The way Luca Moretti's expression had shifted when she mentioned the man in the gray coat. The way his voice had dropped to something colder than anger. Something closer to grief held at knife point. You just made yourself the most valuable person in this city. What did that mean? She rolled onto her side, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. Outside, the street was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that felt like it was holding its breath. By 3 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely. She made tea she didn't drink and sat by the window, watching the empty street below. A stray cat prowled past a streetlight. A car passed, slow and deliberate, but it didn't stop. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself Luca Moretti had more important things to do than think about a florist who talked to graves. She told herself a lot of things that night. None of them were true. Dawn broke pale and cold, the kind of morning that felt like the city hadn't fully woken yet. Isabella splashed water on her face, changed into jeans and an old sweater, and tried to convince herself that today would be normal. She'd open the shop, arrange flowers, smile at customers, pretend her hands weren't still shaking. She descended the narrow staircase to the shop floor, unlocking the back door to let in the early light. That's when she heard it. The low, distant rumble of engines. At first, she thought it was construction. Or maybe a delivery truck making an early route. But the sound grew louder, deeper, multiplying until it rattled the windows. Isabella stepped outside into the alley behind her shop and froze. Black cars lined the street, not 1 or 2, but a dozen, maybe more. They stretched down the block like a funeral procession, sleek and silent, their engines idling in perfect synchronization. Men in dark suits stood beside them, hands folded, faces unreadable. Her neighbors were already outside. Mrs. Castellano clutching her rosary on her stoop, Mr. De Luca peering through his curtains, the bodega owner standing in his doorway with his arms crossed. Everyone was staring, at her street, at her shop, at her. Isabella's pulse roared in her ears. She took a step back, her shoulder blades hitting the brick wall behind her. Then the car at the front, a black sedan with tinted windows, opened. Luca Moretti stepped out. He wore the same dark suit from the cemetery, but in the daylight, he looked different. Sharper, more dangerous, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make the air around him shift. He walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps, and every instinct in Isabella's body screamed at her to run. But she didn't. She couldn't. He stopped 3 feet away, his gaze locked on hers. "You shouldn't have told me that," he said quietly. Her breath caught. I didn't mean—" "I know." His voice was softer now, but no less final. "But you did, and now we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" she whispered. Luca glanced over his shoulder at the men lining the street, then back at her. "The kind where people who know what you know don't usually live long enough to repeat it." Isabella's knees nearly buckled. "Are you going to—" "No." The word was immediate, almost harsh. He exhaled through his nose, jaw tightening. "But the people who killed my mother will, the second they find out you exist." "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "Why would they care about me? I'm nobody. I just sell flowers." "You're a witness." Luca's eyes darkened. "And witnesses are liabilities." The weight of his words settled over her like a stone. "So what happens now?" she asked. Luca studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the open car door. "Now, you come with me." "What?" Isabella's heart slammed against her ribs. "No, I can't just—" "You can," he said evenly. "And you will, because staying here means you're dead by tonight." "I didn't ask for this," she breathed. "Neither did my mother." His voice cracked, just slightly, and for a fleeting second. She saw the grief beneath the armor. "But here we are." Isabella looked past him at the street, at the cars, the men, the neighbors watching like this was a scene from a movie they couldn't turn off. Her whole life was in this building, her shop, her routines, the small, quiet existence she'd built to keep herself safe. And now it was all falling apart. She met Luca's gaze again, searching for something. Reassurance, maybe, or a reason to trust him. What she found instead was exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying too much for too long. "If I go with you," she said slowly, "what happens to my shop?" "I'll have someone take care of it." "And my things?" "They'll be brought to you." "And me?" Her voice was barely audible now. "What happens to me?" Luca's expression softened, just a fraction. "You stay alive." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't comfort, but it was honest. And in that moment, honesty was the only thing she had to hold on to. Isabella swallowed hard, her hands still trembling as she stepped forward. Luca opened the car door wider. She hesitated at the threshold, glancing back at her shop one last time. At the pale pink sign that read, "Russo's Flowers." At the window boxes she'd planted last spring. At the life she was leaving behind. Then she slid into the back seat. Luca followed, closing the door behind him. The interior smelled like leather and expensive cologne. The world outside suddenly felt very far away. The driver pulled into the street without a word, and the rest of the cars fell into formation behind them. A convoy of shadows moving through the waking city. Isabella pressed her hands together in her lap, trying to steady her breathing. "Where are we going?" she asked. Luca didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set. "Somewhere safe." And then, he finally turned his head, meeting her eyes. "And then," he said quietly, "you're going to tell me everything." Have you ever told a truth that changed everything? What happened after? Tell us in the comments below. The estate sat on the edge of the city like a fortress carved from old money and older secrets. Iron gates opened without a sound, and the convoy swept through tree-lined paths that seemed to go on forever. Isabella watched through the tinted window as the world outside transformed. From narrow streets and crowded storefronts to sprawling lawns and stone fountains that looked like they'd been standing for centuries. The main house rose ahead. 3 stories of pale stone and tall windows that caught the morning light. It was beautiful in the way museums were beautiful. Untouchable, cold, meant to be admired from a distance. The car stopped at the front entrance. Luca stepped out first, then turned and offered his hand. Isabella hesitated, then took it. His grip was steady, warm despite the chill in the air. The moment her feet touched the gravel drive, he released her. "This way," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike again. She followed him through the front doors into a grand foyer. Marble floors, a chandelier that looked like it cost more than her entire shop, walls lined with paintings of stern-faced men in expensive suits. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and something floral she couldn't place. A woman in her 50s appeared from a side hallway, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked at Isabella with kind eyes and a soft smile. "This is Gianna," Luca said. "She runs the house. If you need anything, ask her." Gianna nodded. "Come, dear. I'll show you to your room." Isabella glanced at Luca, but he was already walking away, disappearing down a corridor without looking back. Gianna touched her elbow gently. "Don't mind him. He's been like this since—" She trailed off, then smiled again. "Come. You must be exhausted." The room they gave her was larger than her entire apartment. A 4-poster bed with cream-colored linens. A sitting area by tall windows that overlooked the gardens. A bathroom with marble countertops and towels so soft they felt like clouds. Isabella stood in the center of it all, feeling like she'd stepped into someone else's life. Gianna set a small suitcase by the door. "Your things. Mr. Moretti had them brought over." "Already?" Isabella's voice was small. "He's efficient when he wants to be." Gianna's smile turned sad. "Rest, if you can. I'll bring you something to eat later." She left, closing the door softly behind her. Isabella sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands shaking again. She pressed them flat against her thighs, trying to ground herself. This is real. This is happening. She didn't know how long she sat there. Minutes, maybe hours. Time felt strange in this place, like it moved slower, heavier. A soft knock pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said automatically. The door opened. Luca stood in the doorway, still wearing the same suit, but his tie was loosened now, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "We need to talk," he said. Isabella nodded, standing. "About the man I saw." "About everything." They sat in his study, a room that smelled of leather and old books, with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a desk that looked like it had weathered decades of difficult decisions. Luca poured 2 glasses of whiskey, slid one across the desk to her. "I don't drink," she said quietly. "Today you do." She picked up the glass. The amber liquid burned going down, but it steadied her hands. Luca sat across from her, leaning back in his chair, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Tell me about the man," he said. Isabella took a breath. "He came into my shop on a Tuesday afternoon, late September 3 years ago. He wore a gray coat, expensive but worn. He had a scar here." She touched her left eyebrow. "And he spoke with an accent, not Italian, maybe Eastern European." Luca's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened around his glass. "What did he ask you?" "He wanted to know who ordered the flowers for Maria Moretti's funeral. I told him I couldn't share client information. He offered me money, a lot of it." She paused. "I said no." "And then?" "He left, but 2 days later I saw him at the funeral. He stood in the back just like me, and when the ceremony ended, he was gone before anyone else moved." Luca set his glass down carefully. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Isabella looked down at her hands. "Because I've learned that going to the police doesn't always keep you safe. Sometimes it just makes you visible." Something shifted in Luca's expression. Not softening. Exactly, but something closer to understanding. "You've been invisible a long time, haven't you?" he said quietly. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Luca stood and walked to the window, his back to her. "My mother's death was ruled an accident. She fell down the stairs in our summer house, alone. No witnesses." His voice was flat, controlled. "But my mother didn't fall. She was careful. She was—" He stopped, his shoulders tensing. "She was everything careful." "You think someone pushed her?" Isabella said softly. "I know someone did." He turned to face her. "But I couldn't prove it. The investigation went nowhere. My father's people swept it under the rug because they didn't want questions, didn't want attention. And I've spent 3 years trying to find out who and why. And now I've given you a lead. You've given me more than that." Luca's gaze held hers. "You've given me hope." The word hung in the air between them. Fragile, dangerous, unexpected. Isabella swallowed. "What happens now?" "Now, we find him, the man in the gray coat." Luca returned to his chair, leaning forward, his elbows on the desk. "And you're going to help me." "How?" "By remembering everything, every detail, every word he said, every movement." His voice softened slightly. "I know it was 3 years ago. I know it's asking a lot, but—" "I remember," she interrupted. "I remember everything." Luca blinked, surprised. Isabella gave a sad, small smile. "When you spend most of your life trying not to be noticed, you get good at noticing other people." For the first time since she'd met him, Luca's expression cracked. Just slightly, just enough for her to see the grief he'd been holding behind the coldness. "Thank you," he said quietly. It was the last thing she'd expected him to say. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings, Isabella woke to sunlight streaming through tall windows. Gianna brought her coffee and pastries she didn't ask for, but found herself grateful for. Afternoons, she spent in the study with Luca, going over details, sketching the man's face with the help of an artist Luca brought in, reviewing old security footage from the funeral. Evenings were quieter. Sometimes Luca worked late, and she'd hear him moving through the halls long after midnight. Other times, she'd find him in the library, sitting in the dark, staring at a photograph of his mother. One night, she found him there again, the room lit only by moonlight streaming through the windows. "You don't have to keep doing this alone, you know," she said from the doorway. He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't heard her approach. Doing what? Mourning her. Luca's jaw tightened. I'm not mourning. I'm finding answers. You can do both. He stared at her for a long moment, then looked back at the photograph in his hands. Maria Moretti had kind eyes, a soft smile. She looked nothing like the world her son lived in. She used to bring flowers to the house every week, Lucas said quietly. White lilies. She said they reminded her of new beginnings. He exhaled slowly. After she died, I couldn't stand the sight of them. Isabella stepped into the room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Is that why you came to the cemetery that night? Because I'd left lilies? He nodded. I thought you were mocking her. Or me. He looked up at her. I didn't expect you to be crying. I cry for everyone I can't save, Isabella said softly. You can't save everyone. I know. She sat down in the chair across from him. But I can try. Luca studied her, really studied her, like he was seeing her for the first time. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone harder, someone more afraid. Isabella smiled faintly. I am afraid. I'm just good at hiding it. So am I, he admitted. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from two people realizing they weren't as alone as they thought. Luca set the photograph down on the table beside him. The man you saw? We've narrowed it down. Eastern European, scar over the left eye. He worked for someone in my father's organization, someone close. Isabella's breath caught. You think it was an inside job? I know it was. His voice hardened again. And when I find out who gave the order, I'm going to... Luca! She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. What would your mother want you to do? He flinched like she'd struck him. Don't, he said quietly. Don't what? Don't ask me that. His hands curled into fists. Because if I think about what she'd want, I'll have to admit that she wouldn't want any of this. Not the revenge. Not the violence. Not the man I've become. Isabella reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. His gaze dropped to where their hands touched, and for a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. I don't know how to be anything else, he whispered. You don't have to know yet, she said. You just have to try. Who taught you that grief is something you carry alone? Tell us in the comments below. The name came 3 days later. Luca's men had traced the man in the gray coat through old surveillance footage, border crossings, and whispers from informants who still owed favors. His name was Viktor Sokolov, a freelance enforcer who'd worked contracts across 3 continents. But the name that came with his was the one that made Luca's blood run cold. Carmine Tesaro. Isabella watched from across the study as Luca stared at the file on his desk, his face drained of color. Who is he? She asked quietly. Luca didn't answer right away. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles went white. He was my father's right hand, he finally said, his voice hollow. For 30 years, he was at every wedding, every funeral, every Christmas dinner. He held me when I was a baby. He looked up at her, and the devastation in his eyes made her chest ache. He called my mother Sorella, sister. Isabella's stomach twisted. Luca! He ordered her death. The words came out flat, dead. And my father let him stay. Either he didn't know, or he didn't care. Luca stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. 3 years. 3 years. and the man who killed her has been sitting at my father's table. What are you going to do? Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. Luca turned to the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. What I should have done 3 years ago. Luca, wait. I'm done waiting. His voice was sharp now, cutting. I'm done pretending. I'm done playing the dutiful son while the man who murdered my mother walks free. He moved toward the door, but Isabella was faster. She stepped in front of him, her hands pressed against his chest. Stop, she said firmly. Move, Isabella. No. His eyes flashed with something dangerous. You don't understand what you're asking. I understand exactly what I'm asking. She didn't back down, even though every instinct told her she should. I'm asking you not to become the thing you hate. You think I care about that right now? His voice rose, raw and ragged. You think I care about being good when the man who took everything from me is still breathing? I think you care about honoring her, Isabella said, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. And she wouldn't want this. Don't. He grabbed her wrists, not hard, but firm enough to move her aside. Don't tell me what my mother would want. You didn't know her. You're right. I didn't. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. But I know you. And the man I've spent these last 2 weeks with. The one who brings me coffee because he noticed I drink it black. The one who sits in the dark staring at her photograph because he's too afraid to let anyone see him cry. That man wouldn't do this. Luca's grip loosened. His breathing was harsh, uneven. He killed her, Isabella. He whispered. And the brokenness in his voice nearly undid her. He looked her in the eyes, and he killed her, and I wasn't there. I wasn't there to stop it. I know, she said softly. And that's not your fault. It feels like it is. I know that too. For a long moment they stood there, him holding her wrists, her holding his gaze, both of them on the edge of something they couldn't take back. Then Luca released her and stepped away, running a hand through his hair. He looked older suddenly, worn down by the weight of everything he'd been carrying. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice breaking. Just let him go? Pretend it never happened? No. Isabella shook her head. I want you to get justice. Real justice. Not the kind that turns you into your father. There is no justice in this world, Luca said bitterly. Only power. Then use your power differently. She moved closer, her voice gentle but unyielding. Your mother's death doesn't have to mean more death. It can mean something better. Something that honors who she was, not what was taken from her. Luca closed his eyes, his jaw working. You're asking me to be stronger than I am. No! Isabella reached up and cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. I'm asking you to be exactly as strong as you already are. His hands came up, covering hers. For a moment, they just stood there, breathing in sync, the space between them charged with everything they hadn't said. Then the door burst open. One of Luca's men, a younger soldier named Marco, stood in the doorway, out of breath. Boss, we have a problem. Luca's expression shifted instantly, back to the cold, controlled mask. What is it? Tesoro knows. Marco's voice was tight. He knows we've been asking questions, and he knows about her. His eyes flicked to Isabella. The air in the room turned to ice. How many men does he have? Luca asked, his voice deadly calm. At least 20, maybe more. They're moving on the estate now. Luca's jaw clenched. He turned to Isabella, his eyes hard. Stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Luca, stay here. He was already moving toward the door, pulling a gun from the desk drawer. Isabella grabbed his arm. Don't do this. Don't go out there like this. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. Something softened in his expression. Just for a second. I'm not letting him take you too, he said quietly. Then he was gone. Isabella locked the door like he'd told her to. But she couldn't just stand there. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening. Shouting echoed through the halls, the sharp crack of gunfire, the sound of glass shattering. Her hands shook as she backed away from the door. This is my fault. I told him the truth. I brought this into his life. More gunfire, closer now. She looked around the room, searching for something, anything she could use. But what was she supposed to do? She wasn't trained for this. She wasn't strong enough, fast enough, brave enough. The door handle rattled. Isabella's breath caught. Isabella! Luca's voice muffled through the wood. Open the door! She rushed forward, unlocking it with trembling hands. Luca stood in the hallway, blood on his shirt. She couldn't tell if it was his. His eyes were wild, urgent. We need to move. Now! What's happening? Tessero's men breached the east wing. We're outnumbered. He grabbed her hand, pulling her into the hallway. There's a car waiting at the back entrance. Gianna's already there. They ran through corridors Isabella had never seen, past rooms full of shadows and distant shouts. Luca kept his body between her and every corner they turned, his gun raised, his movements sharp and precise. They burst through a side door into the cold night air. A black car idled near the garden gate, headlights cutting through the darkness. Gianna stood beside it, her face pale but composed. Get in, Luca ordered. Isabella hesitated. What about you? I'll be right behind you. Luca! A gunshot cracked through the air. Gianna gasped, stumbling back against the car. No! Isabella lunged forward, catching her before she fell. Luca spun, firing twice into the darkness. A figure crumpled in the shadows. Get her in the car! He shouted. Isabella and Luca lifted Gianna into the back seat. Blood seeped through her blouse, dark and spreading. I'm fine, Gianna whispered, but her voice was weak. Just go. More shouts echoed from the house. Luca slammed the door shut and turned to Isabella. Drive. Don't stop until you reach the safe house on Riverside. The address is in the glove box. I'm not leaving you, Isabella said, her voice fierce. You don't have a choice. Yes, I do. She grabbed his jacket, pulling him close. And I'm choosing to stay. Another gunshot, this one closer. Luca's eyes searched hers, desperate, torn, terrified. Then he made his choice. He shoved her into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and fired 3 more shots toward the house. Drive, he roared. Isabella's hands shook as she gripped the wheel. She looked back through the window at Luca, standing alone in the darkness, surrounded by shadows and gunfire, choosing to be the wall between her and the violence he'd been raised in. She pressed the gas. The car lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. And as the estate disappeared behind her, Isabella realized something that terrified her more than any of this. She was falling in love with a man who might not survive the night. The safe house was a small cottage on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind a copse of trees and a rusted gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Isabella pulled the car to a stop, her hands still trembling on the wheel. Gianna was conscious, barely. Her breathing was shallow. her face pale as moonlight. "Stay with me," Isabella whispered, helping her out of the car. "Just a little further." Inside, the cottage was sparse but clean. A single room with a bed, a kitchenette, and a first aid kit bolted to the wall like Luca had known this moment would come eventually. Isabella worked quickly, her hands steadier now that she had something to do. She'd learned basic wound care from her mother, back when her mother was still someone who taught her things, instead of someone who disappeared. The bullet had gone through Gianna's shoulder. Clean, thankfully. Isabella packed the wound, wrapped it tight, and propped her up with pillows. "You're good at this," Gianna murmured, her eyes heavy. "I've had practice." "With gunshot wounds?" "With keeping people alive when they should rest." Isabella brushed the hair from Gianna's forehead. "Sleep." "I'll watch." Gianna's eyes drifted closed. Isabella sat by the window, staring out at the dark road, waiting. Hours passed. Dawn crept across the horizon, pale and hesitant. Still no sign of Luca. Isabella's chest felt like it was caving in. Every worst-case scenario played through her mind on an endless loop. Luca bleeding out on the marble floors of his estate. Luca captured by Tessero's men. Luca dead because she'd convinced him to hesitate, to choose mercy over revenge. "Please," she thought, her hands clasped together like a prayer she didn't know how to finish. "Please let him be alive." The sound of an engine broke the silence. Isabella shot to her feet, her heart in her throat. A single black car rolled up the gravel drive. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her pulse pounding. The engine cut off. A door opened and closed. Footsteps on the porch. A knock. 3 sharp raps, then 2 soft ones. The pattern Luca had told her to listen for. Isabella flung the door open. Luca stood on the threshold, blood-streaked and exhausted, but alive. His shirt was torn, his face bruised, but his eyes found hers immediately, and the relief that flooded them nearly broke her. "You're alive," she breathed. "So are you." His voice was hoarse, raw. She didn't think. She just moved, closing the distance between them and wrapping her arms around him, holding him like he might disappear if she let go. Luca stiffened for a moment, then his arms came around her, pulling her close. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt him shaking. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. "You didn't." Isabella pulled back just enough to look at him. "What happened?" "Tessero's men retreated. We took 3 of them alive." Luca's jaw tightened. "One of them talked." "And?" "Tessero's gone. He ran the second he realized we knew, but we'll find him." He paused, his expression darkening. "My father knew, Isabella. He knew Tesaro ordered my mother's death, and he let it happen." Isabella's heart sank. "Luca?" "He chose power over her, over me." Luca's voice cracked. "And I don't know if I'll ever forgive him for that." "You don't have to forgive him," Isabella said gently. "But you don't have to become him either." Luca looked down at her, his eyes searching hers. "I almost did. Last night, when I saw Gianna fall, when I thought Tesaro might reach you, I almost became everything I hate. But you didn't, because you stopped me." He lifted his hand, brushing his thumb across her cheek. "You keep stopping me. Someone has to." A faint, exhausted smile tugged at his lips. "I'm starting to think I need you more than I realized." Isabella's breath caught. "Luca, I mean it." His voice dropped, rough and honest. "These last 2 weeks, being near you, listening to you, watching you mourn people you never even knew, it made me remember what it feels like to be human. Not a boss, not a soldier. Just a man who's tired of being alone. Tears burned behind Isabella's eyes. You're not alone anymore. Neither are you. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, and for a moment, they just stood there. Two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of grief and violence, learning what it meant to be whole again. 3 months later. The cemetery looked different in the spring. The trees had bloomed, soft pink petals drifting down like snow. The air smelled of earth and new growth, and the world felt a little less heavy than it had before. Isabella knelt beside Maria Moretti's grave, arranging white lilies in the stone vase. Her hands were steady now. She wasn't crying. Luca stood beside her, holding a single white rose. He'd been quieter these last few months. The hunt for Tesoro was ongoing, but Luca had changed the way he searched. No more midnight raids, no more bloodshed. He'd turned the evidence over to federal authorities, let the law do what his rage couldn't. It wasn't mercy, exactly, but it was justice, and it was enough. She would have liked you, Luca said quietly, his eyes on the headstone. Isabella looked up at him. You think so? I know so. He crouched down beside her, placing the rose next to the lilies. She always said the best kind of strength was the kind that looked like kindness. She sounds like she was wise. She was. Luca's voice was soft, full of something that sounded like peace. I wish you could have met her. I feel like I have, Isabella said. Every time you talk about her, I see her in you. Luca turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was so open, so unguarded, that it stole her breath. I love you, he said, simply and without hesitation. Isabella's heart stumbled. Luca! You don't have to say it back. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. I just needed you to know, because I spent 3 years living like I was already dead. And then you stumbled into my life, crying at my mother's grave, and somehow, I don't know how, but somehow you made me want to live again. Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks, but she was smiling. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for a while now. Luca pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her the way people hold things they're afraid to lose. And Isabella held him back just as tightly, because she understood what it meant to be afraid, and to choose love anyway. What happens now? She asked, against his chest. Now, Luca said, his voice steady and sure. We live. We build something better than what came before. And we make sure my mother's memory means something more than violence. Isabella pulled back to look at him. And us? Us? Luca smiled, a real smile, the kind she'd only seen a handful of times. We figure it out. Together. He leaned down and kissed her, soft and slow, like they had all the time in the world, and maybe, for the first time in both their lives, they did. Later, as they walked back through the cemetery gates, hand in hand, Isabella glanced over her shoulder one last time. The lilies and the rose sat side by side on Maria Moretti's grave, white petals catching the afternoon light. Some people leave flowers on graves to honor the dead. But Isabella Russo had learned something else in these last few months. Sometimes, the flowers we leave behind are the ones that teach us how to bloom again. What would you want the people you love to remember you by? Fear, or the way you made them feel safe? Tell us in the comments below. They say the mafia doesn't forgive, but they also say love doesn't conquer all. Isabella and Luca proved both of those sayings wrong, not because they were stronger than the world they lived in, but because they chose every single day to be softer than it. And in the end, that was the most dangerous thing they could have done. Thank you for watching Mafia Folklore. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. We read every single one. And if you want more stories of love, danger, and redemption, well, you know where to find us. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, every legend starts with a choice.